Hey guys, I'm back for another Grow Group Help, and we are now getting really towards the end. We don't really have that many more chapters to go. Now, you may be thinking, well, Kyle, we still got chapters 25 through 40. How are we going to accomplish that? Well, a lot of this is not going to be verse by verse. We're now getting to some parts of Exodus where it's going to be more thematic, and we're really going to be walking through some of the specific contributions of the tabernacle, the priestly garments, and all these different things, and they're going to be a reminder to the students and really to us of the desire that God has to dwell with his people, but then also the seriousness of worship. So I'm going to try to tackle this the best way I can. So what we're going to do is we're really going to try to stick to kind of the Christ-centered exposition train of thought of I'm going to preach mainly Exodus 25 through 27, or if you're a lady, you'll hear that from Sarah Lang, and I'm super excited to hear how that's going to go. Um, but what we'll do is we'll do that, and then really 35 through 40 we'll tackle a little bit later. I'll just reference them and say, hey, it's describing in 25 through 27 what are the parts of the tabernacle and the tabernacle itself, but then also the execution of how they did it, how they put it together. That is in chapters 35 through 40. So, with that being said, um, one of the big things we need to know is like why the tabernacle was even made in the first place. Well, God makes it very clear to Moses when the Lord spoke to Moses in chapter 25. If you look at verse 8, it says, they were to make a sanctuary for me so that I may dwell among them, which is really interesting because that word dwell means to take residence, to live, to meet with the people of God. And it was supposed to be a very serious thing because it says in verse 9, you are to make it according to all that I show you, the pattern of the tabernacle as well as the pattern of all its furnishings. So what God was saying is, you're going to make all these things, but you're going to make it according to what I've told you to make it, and you're going to make it with the finest of the offerings that you bring out of your heart. And so, what's really interesting is a lot of these different things like the ram skin, the dyed red, the fine leather, and all that. Well, where did they get this from? A lot of scholars speculate that they got this from Egypt when they were pillaging and taking their stuff. God was saying, hey, it's there. They took it and then they continued to travel with it. And now they were going to use this as a reminder of God's deliverance. So even the offering itself was a reminder of God's deliverance to them that, okay, God, you've saved us, so now we're going to give back to you. And part of that was to the tabernacle. So you see that in the first couple verses, but then you see some interesting, just some really cool things. I just want to highlight a couple things. Is the Ark of the Covenant, even just that itself is really cool to me because it had to have holes where the poles could go through so that it could be mobile. That's what I put in here. It was mobile. It was meticulously made with gold and specific types of different things that went with it to make it mobile. And then the most important part, or two really most important things of it, is inside of it was the Ten Commandments. It talks about that the testimony would be inside of it, but what would be the thing to cover it? The thing that would be to cover it um, is the mercy seat or the atonement cover. And that is the part where the great high priest and this ark would go into the Holy of Holies, separated from, the most holy place separated from the Holy of Holies, or the holy place. This most holy place would have this ark with the mercy seat on top. And the high priest could only come in once a year, offer a sacrifice. People put blood on the mercy seat for atonement, and that blood would atone for his sins and for the sins of the people. So again, a picture of God's mercy, of God saying, hey, the atonement language, the atonement, uh, idea is already being set in place. And I find that really neat, all that's being said in the story of the tabernacle. The other thing I think is really interesting is all the images of the cherubim, which was like these angelic creatures that looked like they had wings. They looked like they had different types of eyes. We hear about the cherubim in Ezekiel, and they seem really weird looking. And then you see them again in the book of Revelation. Well, these cherubim were above the mercy seat. But what's really interesting was it's called back to the Garden of Eden, because you remember the Garden of Eden, Number one, the tabernacle faces the east, just like how the Garden of Eden faced the entrance of the east. But then it was closed off because the cherubim would close off because of the separation of sin, because of the fall of mankind, and because of what Adam and Eve did. So this is a reminder of the the allowance for God's grace and mercy, for the mercy, for the atonement. But then it's also a reminder that there's this distance still. You have these different levels of getting into the tabernacle. You couldn't just walk in and just be like, hey, God, I need forgiveness. No, there was steps that had to be taken in order to approach God. So God in his sovereignty is showing, hey, I want to approach my people. I want to dwell with them. But you can't just come in here willy-nilly. There's sacrifice. There has to be an atonement. There has to be certain different things, and it progressed in the finest of materials in each section of the tabernacle until you got to the most holy place, which is where the ark was. The other thing I think is really interesting is the lampstand. 7 places for there to be burning this oil, the olive oil, and it was supposed to be the purest of oil. Find it interesting that there's 7 lampstands, look like tree buds, call back to the Garden of Eden, to the tree of life. It can also call us forward to the tree of life that will be awaiting us in the new heavens, new earth. But then again, it's this desire of that the people would always, and the priests would always be working to make sure the oil never ran out. It had to always keep going. So it's showing God's allowance of saying, hey, I'm here for you. I'm doing this work to meet with you, but also it's our job to continue walking in obedience. So it's this idea that God is meeting with his people, not just we meet with God, but God is initiating himself, but the response is seriousness of worship and all of those different things. So overall, when it's all said and done, if you look at my notes later on, I can't go through every single one of these right now, but all of it's a desire for God to show the way to meet with his people. I think a couple things you can see is you can see a look back that there's this want and desire to always be back in Eden, and that God's people want that, and God's going to deliver that. He's going to deliver it through the true tabernacle because the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. God himself would dwell in the coverings of human flesh and identify with us, just like how in the Old Testament the tabernacle was an identification to be with God's people. Well, Jesus was the ultimate figure of that. He was God in flesh. So God tabernacles with his people, and man, and just the wonders of it. I mean, and just think about all these different things. I wrote all these things down. Jesus is the Word that took residence. He tabernacled with us. Jesus is the high priest and sacrificial offering, allowing for his people to approach his presence. So Jesus is the once and for all atonement. There was no more atonement needed because Jesus was the ultimate one. Jesus is the Word. He is the testimony in flesh to bring the good news and announcing judgment to the world. So he's better than the Ten Commandments because he embodies the Ten Commandments by him being here on earth. Jesus is the door. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So he is the gate. He's the courtyard. And he is also, his flesh was the curtain that was torn for us. And when his flesh was torn and he died, then the literal curtain of the temple torn too, because now we have access to God because of what Jesus has done. If you look at the bread of presence always had to be continually refreshed, and on the Sabbath it would be taken and eaten in a certain way and then refreshed with new bread. Well, we don't need that with Jesus because Jesus is the bread of life. It's a reminder when we take the Lord's Supper. And then Jesus will always be with us, and he is the light of the world. His light never extinguishes. Our light can extinguish. We can extinguish, but his light shines through us and shines his light to the world. So all these different things are pointing Jesus, but then it also points us to how we have the Holy Spirit that tabernacles in us. So now we embody Christ. We're not perfect, but the Holy Spirit in us is what draws us for people to be mobile, meticulous with our faith, and to be on mission. And then we always look forward in anticipation for the true tabernacle, which is the new heavens, new earth. That's the reason why the book of Hebrews is like, hey, we don't go to Mount Sinai anymore. the tabernacle was a way of coming down, God coming down from Mount Sinai to be with his people. And God is showing us that because Jesus came down and tabernacle with us, Mount Zion, heaven, is available to us. That's Mount Zion. That's the future for us. So I pray that you would take all this in. A couple things that I'm going to read with the guys. I almost said dudes, but basically, even though you have access to God, you must dedicate yourself to preparation and purity. Recognize that you are the tabernacle where God dwells. God dwells in your heart. So how much more important is that we do live a holy life? And then the three things I'm gonna reiterate is work out your salvation meticulously, with mobility, and mutually. That we are to be meticulous with our faith. With everything else in our life that we're meticulous with, we are to be meticulous in our holiness. We're supposed to be mobile. We're supposed to be spreading the good news. We're supposed to be showing that there is access to God, to our neighbors, to our friends. And then mutually is by also having huddles, having small groups, having grow groups where we can hold each other accountable. I know this was a longer one. I hope this is useful. And I know this is not even touching the surface, but it gives you a little bit of glimpse of where we're going this week for Exodus 25 through 27. Have a great week.